On January 15th, 1974, 3 teenagers came home from school to discover a grisly scene that no child should ever have to witness. The kids' parents, Joseph and Julie Otero, and their 2 youngest siblings, Joey and Josie, had been bound, tortured, and left strangled in various rooms of their Wichita house. The scene looked like something straight out of a horror film, but the monster responsible wasn't some shadowy drifter or a headliner on the FBI's most wanted list. He was Dennis Rader, a Cub Scout leader, church council president, and the future poster child for how the hell did nobody notice this creep? After forcing his way into the Otero home at gunpoint, Rader tied up the family, fumbled his way through 4 strangulations like a rank amateur, and left behind a crime scene that would haunt Kansas for decades. And that's the paradox of one of the most feared serial killers of the last century. He was kind of an idiot, which is part of what makes the story so intriguing and chilling at the same time. On the surface, Dennis Rader is the BTK killer. Bind, torture, kill. A creepy acronym he coined himself because he thought he was clever. And the headlines at this time seemed to back this up. Sadistic home invasions, letters to police, and the image of an evil genius leading a double life in the suburbs. For years, Wichita lived under Rader's shadow, knowing he was still out there. But that's just a surface story everyone's heard about. The further down you go, the uglier and more confusing this twisted tale becomes. Between 1974 and 1991, Rader killed 10 people. That's the stat most people know, but the number hides the gaps, the silence, the way he disappeared for years only to pop back up like a bad sequel nobody asked for. He taunted the police constantly, wrote letters to the newspapers riddled with details only the killer could know, and he even bragged about his so-called projects. This repulsive nutjob even suggested nicknames for himself, like a fucking gamer tag or something. BTK is what stuck, but only because law enforcement didn't have time to indulge in his fantasy world. But the crazy part is that this muttonhead somehow kept getting away with killing. For 30 years, the self-styled criminal mastermind managed to evade capture. Not because he was good at what he did. He wasn't. Not by any stretch of the imagination, which we'll get into more in a minute. No, this animal evaded capture for decades by relying on nothing but blind luck. Back in the 70s and 80s, the Wichita police weren't dealing with DNA databases, cell phone pings, or internet breadcrumbs like we have today. They were chasing a ghost while Rader sat at home with his wife and kids, mowing the lawn, serving his church, and pretending to be an upstanding guy. Like so many other serial killers, this one lived in plain sight, which was exactly how he liked it. But unlike other whack jobs who got off on destroying lives, BTK didn't just kill. He built little shrines to his murders, saved trophies, and staged photographs where he tied himself up pretending to be his own victims. Normal family man by day, dollar store Buffalo Bill by night, and still no arrest was made for almost 25 years. During that time, BTK became sort of a campfire story parents whispered about to scare their kids into locking the doors and avoiding strangers. Yet somehow from 1974 to 1991, Wichita learned to live with the monster in its backyard. And make no mistake, for all of his bullshit antics and groundless posturing, Dennis Rader is a monster. Part of what made BTK so difficult to catch were his long periods of cooling off between groups of killing. But these had nothing to do with laying low or changing up his MO. And Dennis Rader sure as hell didn't stop because he found Jesus. He simply stopped killing for long stretches of time because life got busy. Promotions at work, family responsibilities, and mundane suburban dad stuff. At the end of the day, murder was just a side hustle for this loon. In fact, he once admitted to police that he'd scout a victim for months and then bail out on the murder because his schedule didn't line up. That's not genius, that's mediocrity with a body count. And the truth is, the taunting letters he wrote were Rader's real addiction. Killing fed his ego, but writing about it was his crack. In 2004, decades after his first murders, BTK couldn't stand being forgotten. He saw an article claiming he was old news, and that was too much for Rader's fragile ego. So he came out of retirement to brag again, sending the police and newspapers packages stuffed with puzzles, doll parts, and victim details. This part of the story is where his arrogance ultimately led to his downfall, and it is absolutely insane. In 2005, BTK wanted to use technology to taunt the police, so he wrote a letter to them asking if a floppy disk could be traced. They told him no, and the criminal mastermind believed them. I'm not making this up. That's how stupid this guy was. On February 16th, 2005, BTK mailed another message, this one stored on a purple floppy disk to a local TV station, which he also signed with the words, "Love Dennis." The metadata pointed directly to Dennis Rader's church computer, the church where he was president of the council. So after 30 years of bluffing and blustering, Rader gave himself away because he trusted a floppy disk more than his own survival instincts. The evil genius, quote-unquote, got caught because he didn't know how Microsoft Word works. When police knocked on his door 9 days later, BTK folded like lawn furniture. No shootout, no final act. Just a sad, balding, middle-aged twat in handcuffs and a short-sleeved button-up shirt, trying to spin his crimes into some twisted fantasy about Factor X driving him. He wanted to be remembered as a boogeyman. Instead, he'll be remembered as the dumbass who torched his own secret with a floppy disk. Yet for all of his deficiencies as a criminal, Dennis Rader was a deeply disturbed individual who never killed on a whim. He rehearsed his crimes and documented his projects, filling binders with notes and photos reenacting his fantasies. He dressed in women's underwear, tied himself up, and posed with masks or wigs while pretending to be his victims. No, these weren't spur-of-the-moment acts of violence. They were carefully plotted rituals to feed his inner theater. Premeditated. The trophies he hoarded weren't just keepsakes, they were props for his private show. In his basement, Rader staged elaborate self-portraits, hanging upside down, gagged, tied to pipes, imagining himself as the women and children he murdered. He even stored drawings of dream kills he never got around to, as if his life were one long audition for the world's worst snuff film. And then there's his family. For decades, these poor victims lived under the same roof and never knew they were related to a monster, albeit not a very bright one. Understandably, Rader's wife filed for divorce the moment he was arrested, claiming she was blindsided by the truth. His daughter described her father as loving, attentive, and completely normal. Imagine discovering your Cub Scout dad spent weekends murdering neighbors and posing for bondage selfies in your basement. I can't imagine what the hell that must have felt like, and even his daughter admits she's never been able to wrap her head around the killings. Because the dark abyss of the BTK isn't just his crimes, it's the mind-numbing banality of his life away from murder. Is that what motivated this idiot? The sheer boredom of Dennis Rader's life outside of his fantasy world? After all, he wasn't Hannibal Lecter. Hell, he wasn't even a halfway competent serial killer. He was a petty, horny control freak whose greatest joy was mailing taunts to the cops. Even when he was finally sentenced, Rader gave a vanilla courtroom confession that sounded like a PowerPoint presentation. He flatly described each murder in the driest, most bureaucratic tone imaginable, pausing occasionally to explain his thought process like a bad lecture. No emotion, no remorse, just a middle manager explaining how he optimized his workflow. That's the chilling part, not the murders, not the bondage. Those are all fucked up in their own right. The fact that this janitor of the macabre treated everything like a job performance review at a discount insurance company. Make no mistake, Dennis Rader's crimes were as horrific as they come. We're not diminishing that in any way, but there are a lot of layers to the serial killer, and none of them are impressive. The BTK tale is a story of horror, incompetence, and ego. On the surface, you get the headlines: killer, letters, fear. Deeper down, you see the pathetic man behind the mask, a suburban fraud desperate to be noticed. And when you get to the bottom, you realize how small he actually was. He wanted to be a legend. He wanted the world to fear him forever. But Dennis Rader will go down as something else entirely. The guy who thought a floppy disk was untraceable. Bind, torture, kill, and in the end, self-destruct.